Okay, so this is going to be the talk on plants, Land Plants 1. And this is on chapter 29, pages 616 through 632, so about 15 pages in your text. Out of all the chapters that you can read this semester, this is the one that I think you should definitely read, because this is probably going to be the one that has the most vocabulary that's going to be important for understanding what's going on with plants. So with plants, we need to talk about the evolution of land plants and how that occurred. And so all land plants are considered embryophytes. And so embryophytes are just plants that have embryos, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means as to a seed or a spore, etc. And so the closest relatives of land plants are, of course, green algae, but remember we had two kinds of green algae. We had chlorophytes and we had charophytes. So the one that's the closest relative are actually the charophytes. That's without the L, right? C-H-A-R-O, charophytes. Those are the closest relatives of land plants. And so there's a constant debate in the botanical community as to whether charophytes should be considered land plants or not. And there are some arguments for and there are some arguments against. And so now in general, and I think in your text and in this class, we'll consider charophytes to not be embryophytes. But let's just go over some of the arguments for and against real quick. So, so the arguments for yes. So there's three arguments for yes. Number one here is that the similarities. So the similarities, the first argument is that land plants and charophytes both have these rings of cellulose synthesizing proteins. So you can see these rings here, and in chlorophytes and other distant relatives, these are linear sets. And so this is a similarity between embryophytes and charophytes that other distant relatives don't have. These cellulose synthesizing proteins are what make cell walls, right? Because as you know, plants have cellulose-based cell walls. Another piece of evidence is the sperm structure. And so sperm structure is very similar between charophytes and embryophytes. In fact, they're nearly identical. And so this is, again, the synapomorphy that can connect the two groups. And then lastly, the third argument here is that both charophytes and embryophytes, land plants, both form something called a phragmoplast. And we talked about this a bit when we talked about mitosis in the first week. We said that during cytokinesis, plants form what we call a cell plate or a baby cell wall. That's basically the phragmoplast. It's what forms between cells when they're dividing. And so charophytes and embryophytes have a very similar phragmoplast. So those are three arguments for yes. In other words, yes, charophytes should be considered land plants. However, there are four arguments for no. And so now we'll look at the differences. What are the differences between charophytes and embryophytes where we can say, no, embryophytes are more distinct, they're more different, and so we should just consider embryophytes as land plants and not include charophytes. So the first argument there is something called alternation of generations, which again we talked about during the meiosis lecture first week. So alternation of generations is where you spend half your life as a haploid organism and half your life as a diploid organism. And so embryophytes do this. They alternate between these two multicellular stages. A haploid stage, and so this haploid stage is called a gametophyte. Okay? This is our first big vocabulary term that you need to know. A gametophyte is the haploid stage in all embryophytes. Okay? Every embryophyte we'll talk about for the next 2 weeks has a gametophyte stage. This is going to create gametes, because gametes are haploid. And so this is going to go through mitosis to create sperm, go through mitosis to create eggs. And you can see that here. We have our haploid stage here, and we have our gametes being created by our gametophyte sperm, and then this could be an egg, this could be a sperm. Our gametophyte here is creating those. The other stage here, the diploid stage, is the sporophyte. Okay, the sporophyte is the diploid stage that all plants have as well. Right? All plants have those two stages, gametophyte and sporophyte. Gametophyte is haploid, sporophyte is diploid. Okay? And so when those gametes come together, the sperm and the egg come and meet, they form the sporophyte. Okay? The sporophyte is here, the diploid portion. Okay? And then the sporophyte is going to produce the spores. And so that prefix, sporophyte, spore, means spore. So it's going to produce the spores, and it does through by meiosis. So here are the spores that it produced. Okay, so when you think of gametophyte, think of gamete, produces gametes. When you think of sporophyte, think of spore, it produces spores. Okay, the thing is, both gametes are haploid, right? Egg and sperm are haploid, and spores are also haploid. The thing is that in the gametophyte, you're producing your gametes through mitosis. Remember, you're producing the same ploidy. So mitosis, you produce your gametes. But the sporophyte is also producing haploid spores, but it does through by meiosis. And if you recall, meiosis halves the ploidy. And so meiosis, the sporophyte goes through meiosis, and it produces the haploid spores. Okay? That's going to be a critical part of understanding plants. All right, and so if we look at the life cycle of embryophytes, here's an example, and you can see here the gametes are coming in and then fertilizing together, coming together through fertilization to form the sporophyte. This is a sporophyte, right? This is a zygote, and then it grows up through mitosis to produce a sporophyte. The sporophyte then goes through meiosis to produce our haploid spores. That spore can then go through mitosis to form your gametophyte. And the cycle starts over again. Real quick, let me turn off the lights. Okay, maybe just one light. Okay. So that's embryophytes. Embryophytes do that. Charophytes, remember this is, should charophytes be considered embryophytes? Charophytes do not go through alternation of generations. Charophytes are haplontic. So that's number one argument why charophytes should not be included with embryophytes. So number two argument. In embryophytes, you produce spores by the sporophyte, which we just talked about. Sporophytes producing spores. But there's a specific organ on the sporophyte called the sporangium. Okay, plural is sporangia. The sporangium is an organ on the sporophyte that produces the spores. Okay, so in embryophytes, the sporophytes produce spores and organs called sporangia. Okay, or singular sporangium. Charophytes do not have sporangia. Okay, so that's argument number two. They lack this structure. And so if we look at our life cycle here, here's your sporophyte, remember diploid, and then it has an organ at the top, basically this top part here, which is called the sporangium. This is where the spores come from. Charophytes don't have that. Okay, so throughout the next 2 weeks we'll be talking about sporangium. That's where the spores come from. Alright, there it is. What about argument 3? Argument 3 is, well, if we look at the gametophytes, the gametophyte produces gametes on a structure called gametangia. Okay? And so just like the sporophytes produce spores and sporangia, gametophytes produce gametes, sperm or egg, in gametangia. So there's a girl and a boy gametangia, right? We need one that's going to produce eggs, and need one that's going to produce sperm. The female gametangia, the one that produces eggs, is called the archegonia. Archegonia is plural. The male gametangium is called an antheridium. Antheridia is plural. And so the archegonia produces eggs. The antheridia produces sperm. Charophytes do not have gametangia. So again, it's argument 3, why charophytes should not be considered embryophytes. Okay, so if we look at our life cycle again, the gametophytes down here, the gametangia are at the top of the gametophyte, in this case with the moss. Archegonium at the top here, antheridium at the top there. So in other words, that's a girl moss, that's a boy moss. I bet you didn't think that there are moss that were girls and boys. But there are. Just like trees and other things. There are girl trees and boy trees sometimes. Sometimes it's both. It's confusing. But yeah, so girl moss, boy moss, girl has archegonia, male has antheridia. They're both considered gametangia. Okay, it's just where sperm and eggs come from. And so yeah, girl, boy. And for a fern, same thing. This is what your gametophyte looks like in a fern. You have an archegonium in one location and an antheridium in another location. So the difference here between moss and fern is that in the fern you have one structure with both female and male, so it's hermaphroditic. While in the moss you had two different ones, one's boy, one's girl. But it's the same thing, it's a gametophyte with gametangia, archegonia and antheridia. Okay, so our fourth argument is that embryophytes, where embryophytes grow from, are called meristems. Okay, so meristems are specific locations on an embryophyte where growth occurs. Excuse me. And so they're areas of cell proliferation, basically areas of mitotic activity, mitosis. Mitosis is occurring at the meristems. So there's two kinds. There's an apical meristem and there's a lateral meristem. An apical meristem is going to grow trees taller, branches longer. Basically, you think it's at the tip of a structure and it grows it forward. And then there's lateral meristems, which not all plants really use that much, but some do. Lateral meristems grow plants wider, fatter. Okay, and we'll talk about both of these later on. Charophytes do not have meristems. They grow basically all over. They don't have a specific location of growth. Okay, so those are our four arguments against why charophytes should be considered embryophytes. Charophytes should be considered land plants. And so we're going with that. We're going with no. But there are arguments for as well. So just know that that argument exists and that that discussion is still going on. So let's talk about how plants evolved. So plants evolved approximately 450 million years ago. This is land plants, right? Before that, we had charophytes and chlorophytes and green algae, but land plants grew or evolved from a embryophyte charophyte common ancestor. Okay, so land plants evolved around 450 million years ago. They were on the land, and so the question is, why not before that? Why didn't green algae go to the land, say, 800 million years ago or 700 million years ago? Well, I think we mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, that it's because of, as you see in the background here, the ozone layer. The ozone layer formed around 600 million years ago. Okay, so it was completely formed about 600 million years ago thanks to cyanobacteria right? Cyanobacteria, which are producing oxygen in the atmosphere, so oxygen built up, oxygen, 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 and then eventually oxygen molecules combined to form O3. O3 is ozone. And so ozone built up in the atmosphere, and by 600 million years ago we have a layer of ozone. And then finally you don't have a lot of that solar radiation hitting the land. And so because of that, land plants could evolve on the land. They can go on the land and not be burned up. And so that's why it happened at this point in time. So there were some major adaptations that plants had to evolve to go from being in the water to being on the land. Some major adaptations. So one of the questions we could ask before we get into what adaptations they had to have is, why go on the land at all? Why not just stay in the water? Well, there were some benefits to living on the land. And so 3 big benefits to living on the land. Number 1 is that you have unfiltered sunlight. Now that the ozone layer is there, it protects you from some of the harmful radiation, and now you have the ability to go through some serious photosynthesis where you don't have a water column in the way that takes away some of that light. So you can create more energy and you can grow quicker because you have more access to light. Secondly, you have more carbon dioxide in the air than there is dissolved in the water. And so, as you hopefully know, in photosynthesis, plants are taking in carbon dioxide, using it to basically sequestering the carbon, taking the carbon out of the carbon dioxide, and then using it to create sugars through that's what photosynthesis is, and then pushing out oxygen. So since we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're able to do that more and more efficiently. And then third, you have all these unoccupied niches. Basically, it's right now it's a wasteland of almost nothing, right? You have bacteria there, you have cyanobacteria, but you don't have anything else. There's no animals, there's no other plants, so you have all these different unoccupied niches that you can, occupy. And so that was a big one. So what adaptations did they need? What evolutionary changes did they need to go through in order to become land plants rather than aquatic algae? Number 1 is that there was barely any water on land. And so because there's almost no water on land, they had to adapt some type of system of getting water now that it was so scarce. And so we'll talk later about roots and things like that they use to get water, and mutualisms with other organisms. We'll talk about that. But they needed to get water somehow. Number 2 is that another challenge is that they had all this support in the water column. And so, but without that, with just air as your medium around you, if you put, for example, an algae that has lived its entire life and evolutionary history in the water, and you put it on land, it just falls over. It doesn't have any support. Okay, the water usually supports it, but now that there's no water, there's nothing to support it. So land plants needed to develop harder structures in order to support themselves in the air. And so because of these challenges, 4 critical adaptations were developed by land plants. Okay, so these are the challenges. 1, 2. We have 4 adaptations to overcome these challenges. So let's look what those are. Number 1 is having durable spore cell walls. Let me change this real quick. Yeah, why isn't this coming up? Oh, there we go. So durable spore cell walls. So basically all these things here you see in the background, the scanning electron micrograph here, are spores, basically pollen. Okay? And having these durable spore cell walls prevented these baby plants, which are inside, right, from drying out. And so remember, we're not in the water anymore, so we need protective structures to prevent from desiccation. Desiccation is basically a fancy word for drying out. And so having really hard, strong, waterproof spore walls prevented them from drying out. Number 2 second adaptation is having something called a cuticle. Now, a cuticle is like a waxy coating that covers leaves. and it covers other structures too. Some plants have stems that have a cuticle. And so again, this is a water-saving structure. If you think of it, wax is waterproof. And so having wax over the surface of leaves prevented those leaves from drying out, prevented the plant from losing water. Okay, that's what the cuticle did. Number three, third adaptation is that they evolved something called stomata. Stomata are basically holes in the cuticle and epidermis and cell wall, and that hole allows for oxygen to leave the plant and CO2 to come into the plant. And so these stomata allow the plants to take in gases and expel gases without having a lot of their innards exposed to the air and drying out. So this allowed them to breathe, quote unquote, without actually losing a lot of the water. And so they also have the ability to close and open their stomata when they want. So see at the top here, this is a closed stomata, and that's an open stomata. And so a closed stomata, you can't obviously expel any gases. An open stomata, you can. And lastly, the fourth adaptation is they had mutualisms with fungi, a specific kind of fungi called mycorrhizae. Okay, that's mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae are mutualistic fungi that help plants obtain nutrients from the soil, specifically mostly water and minerals. Okay, and so in order to get water, they form these mutualism fungi. They give the fungi sugars, so the fungi can survive, and then the fungi suck up more water by increasing the surface area of the roots and also taking in minerals from the soil. Okay, so it's a mutualism that still exists today. Over millions and millions of years this has existed and has allowed plants to survive in terrestrial environments. So there are a couple more adaptations that are only present in some plants. And so I'm going to discuss those now. So all these four that we just talked about are adaptations for pretty much all plants. But there are a couple more that are also present in higher plants. So more advanced plants, like flowering plants and cone-having plants like pine trees and things. So
About 450 million years ago, plants took a giant leap out of the oceans onto the land to become the plants that we know and love today. Now, how did they survive? Scientists at the John Innes Centre may have found out. Land plants survive by getting water and nutrients from the soil. They do this by forming a special friendship with soil-dwelling fungi called mycorrhizae. These strands of mycorrhizae reach deep into the soil and drag the nutrients and water back to the plants. When the first algae landed on soil, how did they survive long enough to form these beneficial friendships? New research suggests that they already had the genes necessary for forming this bond whilst they still lived in the sea. Researchers analysed DNA and RNA from some of the earliest known land plants and algae. They found evidence that their shared algal ancestors living in the Earth's waters already possessed the necessary set of genes needed to detect and interact with the beneficial mycorrhizae.
Charophytes.
The team of scientists believes this capability was pivotal in enabling the alga to survive out of the water and to colonise the Earth. By working with the fungi to find sustenance, the alga showed a clear evolutionary advantage and was selected to thrive in a very different and seemingly infertile environment. This was the watershed moment that kick-started the evolution of life on Earth.
Okay, so those adaptations, so that's just a little video on mycorrhizae. If you couldn't hear that, I'm not sure if you could, it's on the PowerPoint that's posted on ACE. So some adaptations of the higher plants. So the higher plants had to do a little bit more than those four things to survive on land. So if you are small and the lower plants, the less evolved plants, since they're tiny like moss, they didn't really need any structures to transfer water throughout the plant. All they really needed was osmosis. And osmosis is a natural, non-energy requiring process that just, you have less water in a certain location, more water in another location, water is going to move to the area with less water. That's what they use to take up water into the bottoms. Big plants like trees can't do that. There's way too much surface area, way too large of a structure. Osmosis isn't going to cut it. So in those higher plants, they evolved a system of tubes. And these tubes help transport water from the soil down in the roots up to the higher parts of the plants. And so this is an adaptation in higher plants. And so this is called vascular tissue. And so vascular tissue is that system of tubes that plants evolved, higher plants evolved. And there are really two main types of vascular tissue. There's the tissue that takes up water and minerals from the soil and then brings it up to the tops of the plant. And then there's the one that takes sugars from the leaves and then distributes it throughout the rest of the plant. So xylem is the tissue that takes up water and minerals from the soil and then brings it up to the plant. So this is largely for water. And phloem is the vascular tissue that takes sugars developed from photosynthesis. And it takes those sugars and it distributes them throughout the plant, including the roots and the trunk and all the other parts of the plant. So those are our two types of vascular tissue. Only higher plants have this. For example, angiosperms, gymnosperms, and pteridiophytes. We'll talk about that later. Don't worry about the vocabulary. Just know that lower plants, less derived plants, more primitive plants like moss do not have vascular tissue because they're tiny and they don't need it. Okay, there's the second higher plant adaptation. So this is a first, vascular tissue. A second, so here's an example of vascular tissue. If you think of celery, for example, you break celery in half, you see these little dots. Those are basically the tubes of vascular tissue running through the plant. And if you looked at celery, part of that is phloem and part of that is xylem. And so that's the vascular tissue. Xylem is actually made up of dead cells at maturity. So when these are mature, when it matures to a full cell, it eventually dies, and then the cell wall on the top and the bottom disintegrate, the cytoplasm and all the contents are flushed out, and what you're left with is a ring. And the xylem cells stack on top of each other in these rings and make this tube of dead cells, basically cell walls. So if you go back for a second, this is showing, this is a scanning electron micrograph showing the xylem cells stacked on themselves, forming these tubes. And you can actually see these rings of the different cells within those xylem tubes. Phloem, on the other hand, is not dead. Phloem is alive, and phloem actively pushes sugars into living cells that transport it throughout the plant. Okay, so adaptation number 2 is the type of spores they had. So some plants kept spores for reproduction. Some plants had fancier, more complicated structures called seeds. They both basically do the same thing. They're carrying the baby embryo away from the mama to a new location for it to germinate. So seeds evolved from spores. So some plants we'll talk about have spores to carry the embryo away. Some plants have seeds to carry the embryo away. And so the plants groups that have spores and still maintain spores today and never evolve seeds are the mosses, which are the bryophytes, and the ferns and fern-like plants called the pteridiophytes or pteridophytes. But, as you know, most plants we think of today have seeds. flowering plants, pine trees, things like that. So those are gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are the cone-having plants. Those have seeds within the cones.